for the delay. So as I said, the Klamath River Renewal Corporation is a nonprofit organization. And I've been on this board as appointed by the Oregon governor. And we also have 3 other members that are appointed by the state of Oregon, and then also 4 members who are representing the state of California. But the other interesting thing is that there are 10 other people that represent commercial fisheries. They represent Native American tribes, conservation groups, and other government entities. And so that's a really important aspect of this nonprofit, because it shows the collaboration between 2 states and many different stakeholders. And so I wanted to start with this slide because here's the headline: the momentous occasion where the federal government advances the largest dam demolition in history. And this took, as I mentioned, 22 years to get to the point where we could actually get all the regulations and all the permits to be able to take out these dams. In the lower left-hand corner, you can see the biggest dam. I'm not sure exactly how many meters it is, but it was over 150 feet tall. And behind it is a big reservoir. And then down below is a very thin Klamath River, because this is a hydroelectric dam. And so this is just one of the 4 that were challenging to remove. And they were here for over 100 years. So how did we get to the dam removal that took decades to remove? Was a crisis that happened, actually an opportunity. The 4 dams were privately owned by a power company, and they only served to provide hydroelectric energy. They were not for irrigation, and they were not used for flood control. But they did have to have a license from the federal government to operate. And when that license expired, the federal government required them either to try to, build fish ladders up over these very, very large dams, or to remove the dams. And so the power company had to make a decision what they were going to do. But with these dams being as high as they were, as I mentioned, it could as much as 150 feet, you would have to have a fish ladder that was more than a mile long, and that would be completely impractical. It also cost about $1 billion to build 4 of these fish ladders across the 4 dams. So it was decided that it made more economical and ecological sense to remove the dams. But one of the important things here in this particular case is that there are 4 tribes, Native American tribes, that live on this landscape. And they were very crucial in the campaign to remove these dams. But in addition to the 4 Native American tribes, there were also many different conservation groups that were involved in doing all the work that required to try to address the issues that led to dam removal. And one of the things that was really critical and also instrumental in changing the attitudes of people about dam removal, because there was a lot of opposition to dam removal, simply because people feel that dams are a sign of progress. And if you take it down, that means that the environmentalists have won. And so we had to deal with a lot of conflict over those 22 years and be able to resolve the conflict. But everybody could agree that there were very serious environmental quality issues. The stagnant water behind the dams created a lot of water quality issues, lots of algal blooms and toxic algae. It also endangered salmon runs and also there were high rates of fish disease as well. So just to give you a picture of what this basin looked like, it is on the southern part of Oregon, on the west coast of the US, and it is bisected by the California state line. So half of it is in Oregon and half of it is in California. So that complicates things with two different state governments. And from a distance, it's 263 miles from the headwaters, and the headwaters are here in on the upper right. And then it flows through a very large lake, and then it continues through to California into very, very steep mountainous canyons, and then goes out into the estuary here, which is in the Pacific Ocean. So it's about 263 miles total from headwaters to the ocean. And one of the things that is very interesting about this river and its basin is that the whole Oregon part of the watershed is very agricultural and very flat. And then when it flows into California, it becomes a very steep canyon. And that's why most of the 3 of the 4 dams were in California, where the gradient of the river was very steep and mountainous. It was also the 3rd largest salmon producing river on the West Coast. And which means that there were millions of different of salmon that would come back. There were Chinook salmon, there were coho salmon, and then many different species of trout because the water was cold and clear and fish habitat was plentiful here. But when they built the dams, then the salmon runs were depleted. So I will just show you a few pictures of what the upper agricultural basin in Oregon looks like. As you can see, there are a few hills, but it's a pretty flat and very slow-moving river as it flows through this agricultural land. And because so much of the agriculture uses fertilizers, and there's a lot of animal waste from grazing cattle, the water quality was already compromised from agricultural uses. And in addition to that, there was a lot of erosion. And when cattle would graze on these lands, they would tromp and destroy the riparian areas. That's kind of what happens in the West. So here's another map that shows the complexity of working in this basin. And most river basins all over the world are complex, but this one, I think, is probably more complex than usual because, as you can see here, again, this is the Oregon part, this is the steeper California part. And I'm going to concentrate on the 4 tribes that are here first. So in the upper basin, there's a reservation with Klamath tribal members, the Native Americans that are here. And they've lived here since time immemorial, when this was actually a natural ecosystem. And then in California, there are 3 other tribes: the Karuk tribe, the Yurok tribe, and the Hoopa tribe. And if you know anything at all about tribal treaty rights, they have their reservations and they have fishing rights. And so even though they gave up a lot of their land in the treaties of the US, they are still supposed to have fishing rights. But fishing, hunting, and gathering. But when the dams were built, the treaty rights for their salmon were not being honored because many of the salmon became endangered because they couldn't get back up into their spawning habitats. Another very important thing is that another stakeholder here is the commercial fishermen. They have also suffered because a lot of commercial fishermen catch salmon out in the ocean for their living. They also have a number of different federal agencies that work here. We have national wildlife refuges, which are, as they say, wildlife refuges that are supposed to be protected areas for fish and wildlife species. The Klamath Basin is one of the largest Pacific flyway areas, which means that as the birds are migrating, either north to south or south to north, depending on the season, this area is really a critically important area because of the wetlands and resting places for the migratory birds. And they depended a lot on wetlands and the marshes and different riverine ecosystems for their food as they migrate. But the complicating factor here also is called the irrigation project. So not only do you now have 4 dams that have disrupted the ecosystem, but you also have a lot of agriculture in this upper basin that requires irrigation. And so many of the wetlands in the upper basin were filled in and rivers were channelized so that there would be irrigation water to the agricultural areas. So one of the challenges when we were dealing with dam removal is how do we get all of these people who are working in federal agencies, state agencies, with the tribes and the farmers all together to have a different vision of what the Klamath River could look like. So in the very, very top of the watershed, the river actually starts out looking very beautiful and clear. And this is right from the source from the upper tributaries. And way up north, it's crystal clear, cold water, and it's a perfect habitat for very sensitive native trout, like the brown trout, brook trout, and red band trout. Another species that is really important to the tribes and may not be as pretty as trout, but they are suckers, and they're very important in wetland ecosystems. And they're also an important ceremonial and a nutritious species for the tribes. We may not like them that much, but the tribes are covet these fish, and they have been there for thousands of years. But when the wetlands were being filled in and the river channelized, the habitat for the suckers was depleted. And so they are also now on the endangered species list because there's very limited reproduction. They're long-lived species, and without reproduction, they will certainly die out. So there's a lot of effort now to try to restore those wetlands that these suckers need. Here are just a few pictures from the wildlife refuges that are above the dams. And so you just get a sense of what this watershed looks like. It's really beautiful. These are some of the wetlands and some of the mountains, and of course the birds along the flyway. But here we have the 4 dams that we're talking about here. The northernmost one was in Oregon. It's called J.C. Boyle. The next one is a very large concrete dam called Copco 1. There is a little smaller dam named Copco 2, and all of these have reservoirs behind them. And then finally is Iron Gate, the largest one, and that is the furthest down in California. And so here's a photo on the left of the Klamath River as it's flowing through the canyons. And then here in the lower right is the estuary. And this is where the Klamath River then flows into the Pacific Ocean here on the right. And just a picture of the salmon that we all care about. So what is the environmental crisis that started this whole battle for 22 years? And that is as I mentioned, there was the irrigation that is a really important part of the agricultural economy in Southern Oregon. And so they channelized a lot of the Klamath River. They built these irrigation ditches to try to deliver water to all the different farms and ranches. But 2000 happened to be a terrible drought year. And so these irrigation ditches, as you can see, are running dry. There is no water for agriculture. And yet, so many of these farmers and ranchers depend on on the irrigation water for their crops. And so there was a lot of anger that happened and a lot of despair among all the farmers and ranchers because they couldn't get their water. And one of the problems also was that under the Endangered Species Act, you have to provide enough water in the river for the fish. but the irrigators were so angry that they diverted the water from the Klamath River that the fish needed to survive and filled the irrigation channels and irrigated their land. Well, when there wasn't enough water flowing through the dams and down into the lower part of the river, this happened right when the salmon were running back up the river, the few salmon that were still there, and over 50,000 of them died. That was about half the population died in the lower Klamath River because there wasn't enough water. The water was very warm, and oxygen levels were very low because of the warm temperature, and there was a major fish kill. So you can imagine there's already a limited number of salmon for tribal use, for fishermen, and just, you know, important for the ecology of the basin. But when this 50,000 fish died, it was very traumatic, and the tribes were very angry about it. It also created all kinds of toxic algae problems in the reservoir. So here's a picture of, on the left, the Copco concrete dam, and they weren't letting any water through. So all of these, the wall of the dam just grew with all kinds of algae. And then you can see here, it's just a toxic algae soup. And this was in the reservoirs. So the tribes then were very upset. They were already upset because their fish have been diminished from the dams. But when this fish kill happened, it really mobilized them. And so they, all their ceremonies were at risk. They used salmon for food source, and so many traditions that they pass on to their younger generations are revolving around the culture of salmon, not just as a nutrition source, but as a ceremonial fish. Many of their sacred sites were destroyed or polluted by the toxic algae, and so they were denied access to their traditional foods and to their medicines. So I wanted to show this picture because, as you can see, this is Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he was at the time a very famous actor, but also he was the governor of California. And in this picture, I was here during a ceremonial signing where all of these people from the federal government, the state government, you know, governor of Oregon, who's here, Ted Kulongoski and Arnold, the Secretary of Interior, so state legislators from both states, conservation groups, everybody got together. And after 5 or 6 years, we were able to sign an agreement. We all agreed to restoring the entire Klamath Basin. So not only figuring out the water situation and irrigation, but also habitat restoration and dam removal. So this was a really momentous moment in 2010. 30 stakeholders, as I mentioned. And so the next step, once we all came to an agreement, which was very historic, we had to go to Washington, D.C. to get federal permission to actually get federal funding, and then permission from the federal government to take the dams down. And so we worked for another 5 years to try to get the funding through the federal government to take the dams down, now that there was an agreement. But in fact, that didn't work. Washington, D.C., the legislators there, the congressmen, just had other priorities, and there was some resistance about dam removal, and so they did not pass the Klamath Basin Restoration Act, and we were back to square one. So here is 2010 on this timeline, where we agreed to take the dams down, and then we got no money, but this agreement expired in 2015. And so there was a lot of despair. We worked at this point for 15 years to get to this point, and we couldn't get Congress to act. So several people, these people that are all pictured here, got together and said, what can we do? How can we take the dams down without the federal government funding that was needed. So the two states of Oregon and California got together and actually passed legislation to fund the dam removal. So each state put in half the money to do it and decided that the best entity to take the dams down was a nonprofit organization. And so this is where the Klamath River Renewal Corporation as a nonprofit was formed to oversee all aspects of dam removal. This was very momentous because that had not happened in the United States before. Most of the time, it's either private companies or it's the federal government that are in charge of oversight for dam removal. So this Klamath River Renewal Corporation was an experiment. Could we actually do everything that was needed according to all the regulations to remove those dams? And so this is called the Klamath Hydro Settlement Act. And so in 2016, we said, okay, let's do this. And in order to actually get the dams down, though, we needed something called a FERC license, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So even though the federal government was not involved in funding the dam removal, FERC had to agree to have the nonprofit take down the dams and meet all the environmental standards and permitting that was required. So that was the pivotal moment in 2016 that gave us the green light to move forward. And so we were very adamant about all the different ways that we needed to restore the ecosystem. We were convinced that, you know, if we could just take those dams down, we would improve the water quality, would remove the fish passage barriers, we could restore the healthy salmon runs, and we could increase the flow of the river in order to improve the dissolved oxygen. So I wanted to just take a moment to reflect on this. And I know that this is very, very pivotal in the story of dam removal, because even though we formed a nonprofit, the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, and our board oversaw all of the environmental impact statements and all the permitting that was required, it was really the tribes that were the constant voice advocating for dam removal. One of the you've probably all heard of Warren Buffett as one of the richest men in the world. Well, he actually owned those dams. And so it was really important that Warren Buffett heard from the tribes that his dams were actually killing salmon, they were killing jobs and killing communities. And for someone in Iowa, in central United States, to know anything about the Klamath, it was just, you know, he was a shareholder, but he didn't know about all the damage that the Klamath dams created. And so once we got his attention through the tribes, then it was a tipping point for moving forward with dam removal. So here again, just an orientation, the 4 dams were located here, 1 in Oregon and 3 in California. So we had to have a massive number of studies, engineering designs, we had to have management plans, we had to do risk assessments, which means we had to think of every single scenario of what could go wrong. And then we had to make sure that both states, Oregon and California, provided the funding. You know, it's one thing to take down 1 dam, but to take down 4 was really heroic. But finally, on November 17th, 2022, FERC approved the decision to start the engineering to remove the dams. And as we said, it was a very momentous occasion. There was no litigation. There were no appeals of the FERC decision. So we had the green light to move forward. So this was at the end of 2022. So we could actually start in 2023. In 2024, all the dams would be removed. And then from 2025 through 2029, we would begin the restoration and monitoring. confetti. So we had a celebration with the Secretary of Interior, who oversees all the federal governments related to natural resources. And she was Native American. And so this was a very momentous occasion for her as well, because of the fact that, you know, it was on her watch that the dam removal was approved. I'm going to go through here pretty quickly. So the first dam that was removed in 2023 was called Copco 2, and it was the smallest of the dams. And it was really only like 30 feet high, but it was definitely an impediment, and there was a reservoir behind that. And so here we are. I was down there at the time of deconstruction. And so on the left, you can see that they're just bulldozing it a little bit at a time. And I think they completed this project in just 2 months. And then here on the right is what it looks like after they finished all the dam removal. And so the river was flowing freely here. And I just wanted to point this out that with 4 dams with reservoirs behind each of the dams, they had to engineer this very carefully to determine how to drain each of those reservoirs and still allow for flowing river through this area. So it was not only an engineering feat to destroy the dams in a organized fashion, but and with, you know, ultimate safety concerns, but also to make sure that the river still has a path forward. And so there was a lot of, you know, there's probably 2,000 pages of engineering designs on how to actually move this forward. So the initial step was to draw down the reservoirs, and then was dam demolition, and then connecting the Klamath River, the upper river, with the lower river. So I was here at this site. This is the J.C. Boyle site in Oregon. It was a very cold and icy day in January of 2024. This is the reservoir behind the dam, and this is where they blasted a hole in it, and slowly, it was like a bathtub, the reservoir started draining. And I was there with 30 people, including members of the tribes, and there was not a dry eye in the room as we heard the blast, because this was the first one. And so this really meant that we were moving forward. There was no going back once we punched that hole in the dam with the dynamite. And literally 17 hours later, the reservoir was empty, and you can see the channel of the river for the first time in 100 years. So this is Copco number 1, and this is the one that you saw the picture with all the algae growing on the face of the dam. And so this had to very carefully engineer this one. And so here was a blast that was from the bottom of the dam, and then it slowly started draining. And so as you can see, finally the river channel is evident. Then Iron Gate is the lowest one, the one in California, and the last one. And so again, this was a very high dam, and they had to figure out, you know, with all this reservoir behind, you know, how to actually start draining it. And so this was a picture, here I am, with the tribes and members of the board. And this is just literally moments before they started draining the reservoir and blasting the hole in the dam. So there it went, kaboom. And so above here is the what it looked like with the reservoir, and then the reservoir drained and back in the natural channel. But of course, and this is a tributary called Jenny Creek, which had been a really important tributary for migrating salmon. So now we've got this big reservoir footprint with all kinds of mud, and all this has to be restored. And so there was about 8,000 acres of former reservoir land that needed to be seeded and restored with vegetation. try to get some more ecological balance in there, and then to allow for better habitat for the salmon. So we found 98 different species of native plants. We actually sowed about, I don't know, over 1 billion seeds, and some of them were hand planted. The tribes were out there with their mud boots and distributing seeds. We also used helicopters to drop the seeds. And very shortly, literally within just a few months, all this vegetation started growing. And this is one of my favorite pictures of the Klamath River, where the former reservoir footprint that was all mud is now just fields and fields of poppies. And this is in May of 2024. So the really exciting part also was that literally 2 days after the last dam was removed, the salmon were already coming upstream, and fish biologists were monitoring the movement of the salmon, and they were already swimming above where the lowest dam was, and they reached Oregon a month later. So, you know, there had not been salmon in Oregon in the Klamath River for over 100 years. And just 1 month later, after the dams were removed, the salmon came back. We were all marveling. We thought for sure it would take years for them to return. But, you know, their instincts are tens of thousands of years old. And somewhere in their programming, they knew that they were free to go back to where, you know, their great grandparents had spawned at one point. So it was a very exciting. And for the Pacific Northwest, especially the tribes in the Pacific Northwest, as well as people like me, I'm a salmon biologist, and, you know, to actually see these fish starting to recover and going back into their native habitat is something that we're all very passionate about, and we're very excited. And now we have a lot of fish biologists that are out there, and they're documenting the return of these salmon so that we can determine how to do it better even next time for other salmon-bearing streams that are blocked by dams. So this was a big story, the salmon return to the Klamath Basin. So I wanted to just finish up with a few slides. This is one of our Klamath River board members. Her name is Amy Cordalis Bowers, and she was a fish technician in when the fish kill happened in 2000. So she was she works for a tribe. She is tribal and from the Yurok tribe. And when she had to clean up those 50,000 dead fish on her lands in the Yurok reservation, she was bound and determined that she was going to do something about this, and she became a lawyer, an attorney, a tribal attorney, and she was very, very instrumental in helping create the legal framework for the return of the salmon and the removal of the dams. So her chairman, Joseph James, said, "The Klamath salmon are coming home. The people have earned this victory, and with it our sacred duty to the fish that have sustained our people from the beginning of time." So as I'm reflecting on this, I'd like to say that the benefits of river restoration will be far-reaching for all who live along this river. Salmon will have access to hundreds of miles of habitat so they can thrive once again. Dam removal is just the first step in healing the river and its people. And so as I think about, you know, what we've learned over the last 25 years really, is that the advocacy organizations have to work together, but they also have to convince the government to cooperate. Because as we saw, even though there were 30 people from various agencies and nonprofits and the federal government who signed an agreement to remove the dams, if we couldn't get the Congress to provide the funding, we had to come up with another way. And so the crisis became an opportunity to think creatively, and that's when we created a nonprofit to oversee this dam removal. But we had to do a lot of research. We had to have the data to show the positive environmental effects of dam removal. We had a lot of conflict with people who did not believe that dam removal should happen. And we had to find creative ways to be able to communicate that it benefited them as well. We had to find a champion. We had to have people who were very good spokespeople, who could work with the media, who could work with legislators, and really communicate clearly about dam removal benefits. And finally, we really had to demonstrate how these natural flowing rivers with floodplains that were intact would not only benefit landowners and cities by preventing flooding, but also that it was really an economic engine. Because if you have a healthy river and a healthy ecosystem, you also have healthy communities who depend on it.